The church bell echoed through the empty cemetery. Michael Harris flinched under the dim evening light as if the sound reminded him of something he didn't want to revisit. Before him, the grave of his late wife Evelyn lay covered with dry flowers and cracked marble, abandoned for far too long. He knelt, feeling the weight of guilt press against his chest like an anchor tied to his soul. "Never again," he whispered to the cold tombstone, his trembling fingers tracing Evelyn's name. "I promise. Never again." But the promise was already broken. Sarah was waiting for him at home, his new wife, his new beginning. And even as he whispered apologies to the woman buried beneath his feet, a terrible sensation coiled in his stomach. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The air seemed heavier, as if the ground around him was alive and watching. Just as he stood to leave, a sound pierced the silence. A whisper rising from the depths of the earth. "You promised." The sound of clinking glass echoed through the living room, illuminated by soft yellow lights. Guests sipped champagne as they toasted the newlyweds. Michael and Sarah had been married for only a few hours, and even with the cheerful music and laughter surrounding them, Michael couldn't shake the shadow that clung to his thoughts. Sitting at the edge of the dining table, he watched Sarah. She radiated beauty, laughing as she danced with friends. But there was something in her eyes that deeply unsettled him. Perhaps it was just the guilt still gnawing at him. Broken promises have a way of creeping back to haunt you, and this one, in particular, made him feel like a traitor. When the night finally ended, the two retreated to Michael's old house, a simple and rustic home on the outskirts of Ravenswood. Sarah, tired but smiling, collapsed onto the bed with a relieved sigh. Michael sat at the edge of the mattress, restless. There was something different about the house, as if the walls had witnessed an act they could not approve of. The home that had once belonged to Evelyn now belonged to another woman. "Relax, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, brushing his arm and snuggling close to him. "This is what they call a fresh start." Michael forced a smile, but his mind remained chained to Evelyn's tombstone. Later that night, when silence filled the room, Sarah began to stir under the sheets. That was when the nightmare came. She found herself standing in front of an open grave, wrapped in a cold mist that smelled of damp earth and decaying flowers. A woman emerged from the bottom of the pit, her face pale and deformed, with strips of skin hanging loose and lifeless eyes. And yet Sarah knew exactly who she was. "You will be less yourself with every passing day," the figure whispered, approaching with a frozen smile. Before Sarah could run or scream, icy fingers touched her face and a dreadful sensation swept over her, as if her soul were being drained. Sarah woke up gasping for air. The room was dark and Michael slept soundly beside her. For a moment she lay still, paralyzed, her eyes wide in the dim light. The dream felt more real than any nightmare she had ever experienced, like something had tried to crawl inside her, to settle beneath her skin. Trying to calm her racing heart, Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to believe it was just a dream. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Michael woke up with a heavy sensation in his chest, as if a stone were pressing against his ribs. The morning in Ravenswood was cold and overcast, and the silence in the house felt oppressive. When he turned over in bed, he realized Sarah was already up. For a moment, he allowed himself to take a deep breath, but the tranquility was brief. The image of Evelyn's tombstone returned to his mind like a knife buried deep in raw flesh. In the kitchen, he found Sarah, but she seemed different. She looked distracted, slowly fidgeting with the handle of her coffee mug without taking a sip. Michael tried to smile. "Did you sleep well?" Sarah furrowed her brow as if the question confused her. "I had a strange dream," she murmured, her eyes lost in the distance. A chill ran down Michael's spine. "What about?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if the words were hard to form. "It was someone, a woman. She told me I wouldn't be myself anymore." She let out a nervous laugh. "Weird, right?" Michael froze. His heart raced and a cold sensation crawled down his neck. He didn't need to ask who the woman in the dream was. He already knew. "Probably just a nightmare," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, but something inside him cracked. He could feel Evelyn's presence, as if she were sitting right there with them. Later that morning, Michael drove to the oldest part of Ravenswood to pick up some parts for the workshop where he worked. The route passed by the cemetery, and as he approached it, an unbearable sense of unease gripped him. He tried to resist, but the guilt pulled him like a magnet. He needed to see Evelyn's grave. Michael parked and walked toward the moss-covered headstone. The flowers he had left the previous day were already dry, as if they had withered overnight. The stone, once smooth and polished, now had a jagged crack running across Evelyn's name. And that was when he heard it again. "You promised." The whisper seemed to come from everywhere, from the wind blowing through the trees, from the depths of the cold earth beneath his feet. Michael staggered back, his heart pounding. He looked around hoping to see someone, but there was no one. Only the silent headstones standing like motionless sentinels. That night, Michael sat on the front porch sipping a beer and staring at the cloudy sky. Sarah was upstairs, exhausted and distant, as if the dream from the night before had drained her. Michael couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was coming. Slow, inevitable. He tried convincing himself it was all in his head. Maybe it was just guilt weighing him down. Maybe it was the stress of having remarried. But the truth was undeniable. He had broken the promise, and even though no one else knew, the dead knew. When he entered the house, he climbed the stairs slowly, as if something unseen were pushing him back. He stopped at the bedroom door for a moment, listening. Everything was quiet, but a ghostly whisper echoed inside his mind. "You can't escape." Michael pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Sarah was sleeping deeply, but her face was pale and her lips had turned bluish. For a moment, a terrible thought struck him, that she wasn't breathing. "Sarah?" he called, his voice trembling. He moved closer and gently touched her shoulder. At the slightest touch, she stirred, moving slowly as if waking from a sleep too deep. "I was dreaming again," she whispered, her eyes still half closed. "About what?" Sarah turned her face toward him, her gaze unfocused. "I was inside a coffin, and you weren't there." The next day, Michael felt discomfort grow like an invisible chain tightening around his neck. With every minute spent next to Sarah, the sense that something was wrong intensified. There was a strange distance between them, even when they were in the same room. It was as if her presence had changed. Colder, as though Evelyn were there, silently occupying space hidden behind his new wife's eyes. Sarah remained apathetic. She seemed distracted all the time, touching objects in the house as if she didn't recognize them. Small familiar gestures that used to belong to Evelyn, like twirling her hair around her finger or clicking her tongue when she thought, began to appear in Sarah's behavior, unsettling Michael. He wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but fear and guilt gnawed at him. And then something impossible happened. While organizing the closet, Sarah found an old brooch. It was gold set with small green stones. The moment Michael saw it, his stomach turned. That was Evelyn's favorite brooch. He vividly remembered bearing it with her. It had been placed inside her coffin on the day of the funeral, and no one else could have taken it. "You said you got rid of her stuff," Sarah remarked absent-mindedly, turning the brooch over in her fingers. I did," Michael replied, barely able to hide the panic in his voice. "Then why is it here?" Michael had no answer. A suffocating feeling overwhelmed him, and the air in the room felt as heavy as lead. He snatched the brooch from Sarah's hand and stormed to the trash can, throwing it inside with force. But that night, the brooch reappeared on the nightstand. In the following days, Sarah's transformation became even more disturbing. Her features seemed to shift subtly, and Michael noticed something even more terrifying. When she spoke, some of her words sounded exactly like Evelyn's. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone, the same light sarcasm, the same calculated pauses. "You're different," he muttered one night, watching her from the corner of his eye as they sat at the dinner table. Sarah gave him a strange look, as if he had said something incomprehensible. Then she let out a short, familiar laugh, the same laugh Michael hadn't heard in 10 years, not since Evelyn had been buried. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, confused. Michael didn't answer. His heart raced as he stood up from the table and walked out to the porch to get some air. But outside, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The cold wind blowing through the trees carried fragments of incomprehensible words like whispers rising from the grave. That night, Sarah woke up screaming. Michael jumped out of bed and ran to her. She was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened? What's wrong?" he asked, gripping her shoulders. She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. I can't feel my body." For a moment, Michael was speechless. The fear he saw in her eyes was real and overwhelming. Sarah continued, It's like I'm being buried, like I'm not really here." Michael felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. He pulled her close, holding her tightly, but his mind was elsewhere, at Evelyn's grave. The brooch reappearing, the whispers in the wind, the laugh that belonged to the dead woman, and now Sarah saying she felt as though she were vanishing. Michael knew this wasn't a coincidence. The curse was taking hold, slow and unstoppable. The next few days were a silent nightmare for Michael. Sarah was changing before his eyes, not just in her personality but physically as well. Something was deeply wrong with her. On the first morning he noticed strands of hair on the pillow. At first he thought it was normal, but by the second night when Sarah took a shower, the drain clogged with clumps of hair falling out in pieces. "This is just stress, Michael," she said with a weak smile, trying to convince both him and herself that it was nothing. But he knew it wasn't just stress. In the days that followed, the signs grew worse. Sarah's nails began to crack and peel away one by one, like dry shells separating from flesh. Her skin was cold to the touch, always pale and dull, as if the blood was slowly draining from her veins. Michael looked at the woman he had promised to love and protect, but all he could see was Evelyn's shadow creeping behind every smile and word. His new wife was disappearing before his eyes, like a flower wilting under the sun, with nothing he could do to stop it. Sarah's behavior also began to fragment. She forgot simple things, where the keys were, the names of close friends, important dates. But what truly terrified Michael were the moments when she spoke like Evelyn. One afternoon, while washing the dishes, Sarah stopped and gave Michael a distant look. "You never liked champagne, did you?" Michael froze. That was something Evelyn used to say, a little tease only the two of them had shared. "Sarah, why did you say that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. She blinked, confused as if she had just woken from a dream. I don't even know. It just came to me." A wave of fear washed over Michael's body. It was Evelyn. There was no doubt anymore. The woman he had buried 10 years ago was coming back. That night, things got worse. Michael woke up in the middle of the night and noticed that Sarah wasn't in bed. Cold wind blew through the cracks in the window, carrying with it the scent of rain about to fall. He slipped quietly down the stairs, calling her name, but the house was swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. When he finally found her, she was sitting on the porch wearing her nightgown, staring at the empty road. The high moon cast long shadows around her, and she looked lost in a deep trance. "Sarah?" Michael called, trying to hide the fear in his voice. She slowly turned her face toward him. There was something in her eyes that didn't belong to Sarah. It was Evelyn. He was sure of it, the same distant, almost mocking glimmer he knew so well. "I don't want to disappear," she whispered, and it wasn't her voice anymore. It was Evelyn's, calm, cold, and filled with an ancient sorrow. Michael knelt in front of her, holding her cold hands. "You won't disappear," he promised, even though he had no idea how to stop it. Sarah tilted her head, studying him with an expression that no longer belonged to her. "You know how this ends, don't you?" Michael felt his stomach drop. Yes, he knew. Somehow Evelyn had found him through Sarah, and if he didn't act soon, his new wife would become nothing more than an empty shell, completely consumed by the dead woman. The next morning, Michael decided he could no longer ignore what was happening. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and he needed answers before Sarah was lost completely. There was only one place where he could find them: Ravenswood Cemetery. He waited for Sarah to fall asleep. Her nights were increasingly restless. She thrashed around as if fighting something invisible in her dreams, murmuring incomplete phrases that unsettled Michael even more. As soon as she drifted off, he grabbed his coat, the car keys, and headed to the cemetery. Ravenswood Cemetery sat atop a hill, surrounded by pine trees whose shadows stretched like long, thin fingers. That night, the place seemed quieter and more sinister than ever, as if every grave were waiting for him to arrive. When Michael reached Evelyn's tombstone, something was different. He expected to find the grave exactly as he had left it the last time, but the earth had been disturbed as if someone had recently tampered with it. A deep crack ran across the tombstone, splitting Evelyn's name in two. Fear tightened around Michael's chest. He sensed that there was something in the soil that didn't belong to the world of the living. The cold wind blew harder as if urging him to leave, but he couldn't back down. He had to confront the truth or he would lose Sarah forever. Michael knelt and ran his hand along the crack in the tombstone. The cold stone triggered a flash of memories. Evelyn's deathbed, the promise he made, and her gaze as he swore he would never marry again. "You promised." The whisper came from deep within the ground, soft like a long-buried secret. Michael stumbled back, gasping, trying to keep his panic under control. He looked around, but there was no one, only darkness and silent graves. Suddenly he felt a presence close by, as if something unseen were standing right behind him. He had the overwhelming sense that if he turned around, he would see Evelyn's face smiling at him. But he didn't have the courage to look. Instead, he stood up and left the cemetery, his heart pounding, knowing that he had awakened something that could no longer be contained. Later that night, Michael returned home and found Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed, her gaze empty and distant. She looked paler than ever and her eyes were dull. There was a sense of abandonment about her, like someone who already knew she was lost. "You went to see her, didn't you?" Sarah asked, her voice low and broken. Michael froze. How do you know?" She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled. A cold, familiar smile, the same one Evelyn used to give. Michael felt like he was staring into a deep abyss where Sarah and Evelyn were the same person, trapped in the same prison of flesh and bone. "You can't escape this, Michael." Her voice was steady, but it was no longer Sarah who was speaking. Michael's body trembled as he sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Sarah, or what was left of her. He tried to deny the truth slithering into his mind like a cold serpent, but he couldn't escape it anymore. Evelyn was back, using the body of the woman he loved like a puppet. "I just want this to stop," Sarah murmured, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Michael hugged her tightly, trying to anchor her to reality, but it felt like she was slipping through his arms, like sand falling between his fingers. And that night, the dream came, the dream that would change everything. Michael found himself standing in the middle of the cemetery, but this time the ground was alive, pulsing, breathing. He walked toward Evelyn's grave and to his horror saw two coffins open side by side. At the bottom of one was Sarah, pale, her eyes vacant. In the other was Evelyn, her face lifeless but her smile intact. Evelyn rose slowly, her bones cracking beneath her dry, hardened skin. She looked directly at Michael, wearing the same enigmatic smile as always. "Choose, Michael," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Bury her or bury yourself." Michael's breath left his lungs. I can't." Evelyn tilted her head, her smile widening. "Oh, but you can." She stared at him as if she had all the time in the world. "One of you must stay with me. That's what you promised." Michael woke with a start, gasping for air, his face drenched in cold sweat. Beside him, Sarah stirred restlessly, as if she were still trapped in the dream. Her body shook, her lips were bluish, and her breathing was shallow, as if she were being buried alive in her own skin. Michael knew what had to be done. The curse wouldn't end as long as he tried to escape it. He had broken his promise, and now he had to pay the price. He dressed slowly, trying not to think. He went downstairs and retrieved the shovel from the garage. A horrible sense of peace settled over him, the peace of someone who has finally accepted the inevitable. He climbed back upstairs and found Sarah half-conscious, struggling to breathe. Her eyes were distant, as if she were being pulled into a place beyond his reach. Michael stroked her face. "I know what to do, Sarah. I'll save you." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Michael kissed her softly on the forehead and whispered, "I promise." Carefully, he carried her to the car. The drive to the cemetery seemed endless, and the weight of his decision crushed him. He glanced at Sarah one last time as she lay weakly in the passenger seat. When they arrived, he began to dig. The shovel tore through the damp earth, each strike echoing like the beat of a funeral drum in the night silence. The cemetery seemed to watch him as he dug a hole beside Evelyn's headstone, the very spot that was supposed to be his. Michael knew what had to be done. He wouldn't bury Sarah. He would take her place beside Evelyn. It was the only way to break the curse. He stopped digging and stared into the deep, dark pit before him. This was where his life would end. With one last look at Sarah, who slept in the car, he whispered, "I'm sorry." Then Michael climbed down into the open grave. He grabbed the shovel and began to pull the earth over himself. Each layer of dirt felt like a weight lifted from his soul as the world around him slowly faded away. As the darkness closed in, he heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper. Now you're with me forever. The cold, damp earth slowly covered Michael's body, the crushing weight wrapping around him like an inevitable embrace. Each layer thrown over him brought a terrible sense of relief, a mixture of peace and despair. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, fulfilling the promise he had made to Evelyn. The air began to thin and the soil pressed against his chest, ribs, and legs, but he didn't resist. This was his destiny. If he stayed there, Evelyn would finally rest and Sarah would be freed. Everything would return to normal, or at least that was what he wanted to believe. Through the suffocating earth, Michael heard a voice, soft, almost imperceptible. It was Sarah. Michael. His heart stopped. For a moment he thought it was a hallucination, but then he heard it again. Michael, please. Every word she spoke sounded like it had been dragged through miles of pain and darkness. Sarah was still trapped. She wasn't free, not from him nor from the curse. The sacrifice wasn't working. Something inside Michael snapped. The promise, the love, the guilt, the obsession, all shattered into a single brutal truth. The curse would never end with him buried. Evelyn didn't want peace. She wanted him to drag Sarah into the darkness with her. He tried to move. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest as he struggled to get out of the grave. The earth dragged him down, heavy as concrete, trying to hold him there. Michael began to choke, the air disappearing from his lungs, but he couldn't die here. He couldn't let her win. With desperate effort, he shoved the dirt aside, every movement an agony. He refused to leave Sarah behind, no matter what Evelyn wanted. He had betrayed Sarah once. He wouldn't do it again. After what felt like hours of struggle, Michael finally broke through the surface, pulling himself out of the grave. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body exhausted but alive. As he lay there, struggling to breathe, Evelyn's tombstone seemed to watch him in silence, a reminder that the promise had been broken once again. But Michael didn't care anymore. All that mattered was saving Sarah. He ran to the car, his hands trembling as he opened the door. Sarah lay motionless in the seat, pale and still. For a moment, Michael thought he was too late. "Sarah?" he cried, shaking her desperately. "Sarah, please listen to me." She let out a faint moan, her eyes slowly fluttering open. She was still weak, but she was alive. Michael held her tightly, the relief washing over him like a tidal wave. I thought I was trapped," Sarah murmured weakly, her voice hoarse and distant. Michael hugged her even tighter. "I'm here, you're safe. I promise," but deep down he knew that nothing was over. Michael drove Sarah home in silence, the car cutting through the darkness of the empty road. The weight of the night felt crushing, as if the trees and sky were leaning in to bear witness to what he had just done. Sarah was conscious but still weak, her head resting against the window. Her body seemed lighter now, as though the presence that had once consumed her had finally dissipated. But deep in his mind, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't fully left him. When they got home, Michael helped Sarah up the stairs. She collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, as if the simple act of existing was too much to bear. Michael felt an overwhelming urge to believe that it was all over, that the sacrifice at the grave had freed them both. But the house didn't feel as welcoming as before. Something had changed. The silence around them was oppressive, not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that settles in like a warning. Michael had the unsettling sense that they weren't alone. Sarah drifted into a deep sleep, but Michael stayed awake, restless. The hours dragged by and he couldn't stop thinking about the grave, about Evelyn's cracked tombstone, or her voice whispering, "You promised." Fighting against the growing fear, he got up and went to the bathroom. The yellow light flickered as it turned on, casting strange shadows across the walls. For a moment he stared at himself in the mirror, his face sweaty and exhausted, trying to convince himself that it was over, that everything was done. Then he saw it. For a brief second, the reflection in the mirror wasn't his. In the glass, a familiar lifeless face stared back at him. Evelyn. She smiled. That same cold, ambiguous smile. Michael blinked and the reflection was normal again. He was alone in the mirror, or at least it seemed that way. He stood there, frozen, a chill running down his spine. Nothing was over. The curse hadn't been broken. Evelyn was still there, lurking, waiting. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling better. There was color in her face, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled genuinely. "I feel you're normal again," she said, almost surprised. Michael smiled back, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. They had breakfast together, and for a moment, the house felt lighter, less suffocating, but the peace was fragile. Michael could still feel Evelyn's presence like a shadow hiding in the corners, a broken promise that refused to rest. He knew she wouldn't leave so easily. Later that night, Sarah went to bed first. Michael stayed downstairs, sitting on the couch, staring into the void. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then he heard it, a soft sound coming from upstairs. It was a laugh, low, familiar, impossible. Michael froze. He knew that laugh. It was Evelyn's. He stood up slowly, each step heavy as lead. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully climbed the stairs. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and found Sarah lying on the bed, her back to him, breathing softly. For a moment, he almost believed everything was fine. Then she turned to face him. And in her eyes, Michael saw what he feared most. Evelyn was still there.